What is up, Watch Fam? I am Christian from Theo and Harris, and today we're going to be talking about buying vintage and pre-owned watches. And I'm going to be telling you some of the questions that you should be ready to ask your dealer. Today, I am wearing my Breitling Super Ocean Heritage 42mm watch, quite big for my wrist, but I do wear it anyway. I kind of feel like one of those, modern watch people running around, as opposed to the obscure vintage geek I often am. Love the bracelet, love the dial. It is an heirloom to me, so I didn't buy it, probably wouldn't have for myself, but I really do love wearing it, especially in the summertime. So, vintage and pre-owned watches. Vintage and pre-owned are two very, separate ideas. Vintage watches, we're talking about watches 20, 30 years old, watches that are pretty dissimilar to the things being offered now at retail, whereas pre-owned watches are newer watches in the last, 1 year to 10, 15 years old, contemporary watches that you could easily see in a Rolex boutique, watches that you could easily see in a Breitling boutique or in a Panerai boutique, despite maybe those exact watches being discontinued. They're still contemporary. The pre-owned watch market is a wonderful vehicle to acquire contemporary watches for a considerable discount off of retail. Long story short, some guy walked into a Rolex boutique or a Panerai boutique, bought a watch, wore it, maybe lightly so, maybe he beat the hell out of it, either way, went to go sell it later on, and now you're thinking about buying it. But the first guy took the chunk of retail depreciation, which in certain brands, like I said, Breitling, Panerai, IWC, many brands, could be, 20, 30, 40%. It could be 60%. That being said, there are also many models that they actually go up after they've been owned, but we won't even get into that story. The vintage market is not a way to acquire, contemporary pieces for less. It's just not the case. Vintage is an entirely different animal. The offering, the watches, the whole community is very unique. You are buying and learning about history. You're talking about watches that are 40, 50, 60 years old. It's totally different. The technology in the watches is different. The design in the watches is different. The way I look at it is those watches ooze a different era. They represent something that new watches just don't. Brand new watches represent 2019, as they should. A watch from 1958, a vintage Patek from 1958, represents what it was like to be a gentleman in 1958. It's a totally different animal, but the vintage and pre-owned markets share something, and that is how a buyer should navigate them. Everybody knows the givens to look out for: condition, originality, and authenticity. The bracelet, the case, the dial, the movement, everything. And that's terrific. Those are basically the most important items. But there are other details here in the process of watch buying, particularly in vintage and pre-owned, that people don't talk about as much, and those are the problems that I see on Facebook, on Instagram, all over the internet. People saying, crap, I didn't think about that. So those are the things we're going to be talking about. Let's do it. So the first thing we're going to be talking about here is box and papers. The original box that a particular watch was cased in at the time of retail sale, and its sales documents. Certainly a question that you should ask a dealer. Does this Rolex, does this IWC come with its original box and papers? And most people think that yes is a good thing and no is a bad thing. But really the explanation is a little bit longer than that. I have seen mediocre pre-owned and vintage watches with box and paper, and I've seen absolutely immaculate pre-owned and vintage watches without box and papers. And as someone who has both bought watches for themselves and bought watches, to then resell at retail, I know certainly that the better watch is the way to go. I'm talking about 95% of the time. There are, of course, exceptions. But the second, big conventional misunderstanding that I'd like to put to rest here is that box and papers guarantee that the watch is authentic. The idea that box and papers are these great things that guarantee that a particular watch is real is a myth. That's something that I hear all of the time from people that don't buy in watches so regularly. Well, I can't buy a watch without box and papers. What if it's fake? If people can fake a watch, they can fake a box and a set of papers. It's very easy. A box and papers should never, put your mind at rest or help you put your guard down. If anything, they can be disarming if if someone's trying to deceive you or sell you a fake watch. Don't let that happen to you. And of course, the answer there is you always have to buy the seller, right? The seller, whether you've been friends with them and been dealing with them for a long time, or whether they come extremely highly recommended. That's what you need to go with. A great seller with a reputation, to improve or to lose. And if they lose that reputation, they lose their whole business. That is much more of a safety net. That's much more secure than any set of someone else's box and papers. Another big question here is that of return policy. In many cases today, people are buying watches on the internet, and when they arrive, maybe you don't like them as much as you thought. And that does not mean that the watch was misrepresented when it was sold to you. That just means that you put it on the wrist and it didn't hit you like you thought it would. And there's nothing wrong with that. So always ask the seller for their return policy. And maybe if you've been going back and forth, if you're a repeat client or maybe a promising new client, maybe they will amend the return policy for you. I know that in some cases with trusted clients, shops, even like our own, where a store will amend the policy or make an exception based on circumstances. If there's no suspicion that you as the buyer were buying with no intention to keep, that you as the buyer had full intention to keep, but once maybe something came, it just wasn't your thing, things can be worked out. The last thing a watch dealer or any store, I suppose, wants is a negative experience with the client. I think you'd be surprised by how far your either dealers or prospective dealers would go to earn your business and to make you happy. But the only way you can do that is if you ask. The other idea here is warranty. Watches, while inexpensive as far as maintenance compared to cars, are still expensive things to upkeep. If you buy a watch from a shop, you want to know that your purchase is protected for a period of time. This is both with vintage and pre-owned. Things happen with mechanical watches. It's not totally uncommon that your Patek, whether it's from 2005 or 1965, could run into timekeeping problems. 2 weeks after sale or 6 months after sale. Something that you have to understand as a buyer of mechanical watches, whether 4 years old or 30 years old, is that watches are complicated items. Even regular time-only dress watches still are comprised of maybe 100 parts that could be affected by a host of things, shock being one. And as buyers and owners, we have to understand that these watches may need maintenance at some point throughout our ownership. And that's where this warranty comes in. You as a buyer should know how long the seller stands behind this watch. If it was in fact service, as they claim, shouldn't they feel comfortable warrantying it for a year? Doesn't that just make sense? Their watchmaker certainly warranted it to them for a year if it was in fact service. So if you as the client have a problem 3 months down the road, 9 months down the road, 10 months down the road, shouldn't you as the buyer be able to call your dealer and express the problem that you've run into and expect that problem to be remedied by your dealer? Of course. So that's it. Thank you, geeks, so much for watching. If you love this video, please like it. And if you love watches, go ahead and subscribe to our channel at Theo and Harris. I will see you all very soon. Case bracelet movement. Dealers, go ahead on over to Theo. Myth perpetuated. It's a myth. It's a myth. Dealers and possibly. I hate this. Forget it. Don't even say it. Let's move on. The same Basil Patek seemed to have read my diary.